In a small, dimly lit hospital room in San Antonio, Texas, the air was thick with the sterile scent of antiseptic and the unspoken weight of impending loss. Logan Carter, a battle-hardened soldier, sat propped up against his pillows, his once strong frame now frail, ravaged by the unforgiving march of time and illness. But despite the beeping monitors and the quiet murmurs of nurses outside, his spirit refused to break. His thin fingers traced the edges of a worn-out photograph. His little sister Emily, the only family he had left. Outside, the Texas sun blazed down mercilessly, but inside, the cold reality was inescapable. The doctors had given him mere weeks, maybe days. But Logan wasn't the type to drown in self-pity. He had faced death before, on battlefields far from home, where bullets ripped through the air and explosions shook the ground beneath his feet. This time, though, the enemy was invisible, relentless, and unbeatable. Yet, he wasn't thinking about himself. His thoughts were consumed by one regret. He wouldn't be there to fulfill the most important duty of his life. Emily was getting married in 2 months. He had sworn to walk her down the aisle, to give her away, just as a father would. But time, cruel and unforgiving, had stolen that from him. Clenching the photo in his trembling hands, he made a decision. He would find another way. Someone strong enough, someone his sister admired, someone the world respected. Someone who would keep a promise, no matter what. And in that moment, a name came to him. Mike Tyson. The moment Logan Carter whispered the name, it felt like a long shot, maybe even a fantasy. Mike Tyson, the legend, the undisputed heavyweight champion, a man who had dominated the ring with fists like sledgehammers and a presence that made the world stop and watch. Could he really reach him? Would a man like Tyson even listen to a dying soldier's request? But Logan didn't have time for doubts. He had fought wars. He had seen the impossible happen. And now he was about to throw his final punch at fate. With the help of a determined nurse and a few desperate phone calls, the message reached the right people. And then, the unthinkable happened. The hospital room was silent, save for the rhythmic beeping of machines and the occasional whisper of nurses outside. Logan had just closed his eyes, exhausted from another grueling day of fighting a battle he couldn't win. Then, a knock at the door. A deep, unmistakable voice followed. "You Logan Carter?" Logan's eyes snapped open. The voice was rough, low, full of power. He turned his head, and there he was, Mike Tyson, standing in the doorway, a living legend. His presence filled the room, not just because of his broad shoulders and battle-scarred fists, but because of the sheer gravity of the moment. Logan blinked, his mouth opening slightly in shock. "No way," he whispered, shaking his head with a breathless chuckle. "You've got to be kidding me." Tyson smirked, stepping forward, his movements smooth, almost predatory, like a lion who had just entered the ring. "I get that a lot," he said, pulling up a chair. His voice carried the weight of a man who had seen it all, the victories, the losses, the pain, the redemption. For a moment, Logan just stared at him. This was Mike Tyson, the man who had fought the greatest, who had faced monsters in and out of the ring, who had survived things most men wouldn't, and yet, right now, he was here, sitting next to a dying soldier. "I thought you were a myth," Logan muttered, still trying to process what was happening. Tyson chuckled, but his eyes studied Logan carefully. "And I thought soldiers weren't afraid of anything." Logan smirked, but there was something behind his gaze, something heavier, a weight no amount of muscle or fame could lift. "I need to ask you something," Logan said, his voice quieter now. "And it's going to sound crazy." Tyson leaned forward, resting his forearms on his knees. "Try me." Logan swallowed hard and glanced down at the photo in his hands. He turned it toward Tyson. "That's my little sister, Emily." Tyson studied the picture, a young woman in a graduation cap, beaming with pride. He nodded. "She looks strong." "She is," Logan agreed, his voice thick with emotion. "She's getting married in 2 months." He exhaled sharply, looking away for a second as if saying the words out loud made them too real. "I was supposed to walk her down the aisle." Tyson said nothing, but Logan could feel his gaze intensifying. "Our parents died when we were kids," Logan continued, his voice raw but steady. "I raised her. I'm not just her brother. I'm the closest thing she's ever had to a dad." The room fell into a heavy silence. "She keeps telling me to hold on, that I'll make it." Logan let out a humorless chuckle. "But we both know that's not happening." His hands trembled slightly, but his face remained strong. And then he looked Mike Tyson dead in the eyes. "I need a favor." Tyson didn't flinch. He already knew what was coming. When the day comes, I want you to walk her down the aisle. Logan's voice was firm, unwavering. Be the one to give her away. Tyson exhaled slowly, leaning back slightly as he absorbed the weight of what had just been asked. This wasn't just a dying man's last request. This was everything. A lifetime of love, sacrifice, and duty, wrapped in a single promise. Finally, Tyson spoke. His voice wasn't just words, it was a vow. You have my word. Logan's breath hitched. For the first time, his eyes glistened with something unspoken. Relief. Gratitude. Peace. That means everything. And just like that, a legend had promised to fulfill the final wish of a warrior. But what happens next will shake you to your core. Will Mike Tyson be able to keep his word? Or will fate throw an unexpected punch that changes everything? If this story has touched your heart, hit the like button, subscribe, and comment 1 if you believe in keeping promises. If you don't, well, go ahead and like the video anyway. And don't miss the next chapter, because the most heartbreaking moment is yet to come. The weight of the promise hung in the air, thick and unshakable. Logan Carter had asked for something no ordinary man could fulfill. But Mike Tyson wasn't ordinary. He had spent his life stepping into rings where every opponent wanted to break him, where every fight could be his last. He knew what it meant to stand tall when everything else was falling apart. And now, in this quiet hospital room, a different kind of fight was unfolding. Logan exhaled, his body frail, but his spirit unyielding. He had done what he needed to do. His sister wouldn't be alone. She would have a legend by her side. Tyson sat there for a long moment, elbows resting on his knees, eyes locked onto the soldier who had just trusted him with something greater than any championship belt. Then, with a slow nod, he clenched his fists. You don't have to worry, he said, his voice steady. She's family now. Logan smirked, weak but genuine. That's good to hear, because if you back out, I swear I'll haunt you. Tyson chuckled, shaking his head. I believe you would. The two men shared a moment of silence, an unspoken understanding passing between them. This wasn't just about a promise. It was about legacy, about standing up when it mattered most. But time wasn't on Logan's side. Days passed. The beeping of the machines in his hospital room grew slower. His body weakened, his voice became softer, and the once bright spark in his eyes began to fade. But he never stopped talking about Emily. Never stopped making sure Tyson knew how much she meant to him. Then, one evening, the call came. Tyson was in his hotel room, lost in thought, when his phone rang. The voice on the other end was somber. Logan's condition had taken a sharp turn for the worse. Without hesitation, Tyson grabbed his coat and bolted out the door. The hospital halls were too quiet, the air too heavy. Nurses moved with hushed urgency, their faces carrying the weight of bad news they'd delivered too many times before. When Tyson reached Logan's room, he hesitated for the first time. He had been in some of the most brutal fights in history. He had faced opponents who could crush bones with a single punch, but none of that compared to this moment. Taking a breath, he stepped inside. Logan looked small, smaller than before. His breathing was shallow, his skin pale, his eyes tired. Sitting beside him was Emily, clutching his hand, her face streaked with silent tears. She looked up at Tyson, her voice barely a whisper. He told me everything. Tyson nodded and stepped closer. Logan's eyelids fluttered open. A faint smile appeared. Didn't think I'd see you again. Tyson forced a grin, pulling up a chair. Yeah, well, I don't break promises. Logan's breath came in shallow bursts. He glanced at Emily, his fingers twitching weakly in her grasp. She's my whole world, man. Emily bit her lip, her voice cracking. You're mine too, Logan. The room was silent except for the rhythmic beeping of the machines. Tyson swallowed hard. He had never felt this helpless before. There were no punches to throw, no opponent to knock out. All he could do was be here. Logan's fingers tightened around Emily's one last time. His breath hitched. His eyelids grew heavy. And then, nothing. Emily let out a choked sob, her body trembling as she buried her face in his chest. The machines beeped in a steady, hollow rhythm, the sound of finality. Tyson clenched his jaw, his eyes burning. He had seen loss before, but this was different. A warrior had fought his last fight. And now, Tyson carried his final wish. The air in the hospital room felt heavier than ever. The rhythmic beeping of the machines had been replaced by a single, drawn-out tone, a sound that crushed everything in its path. Logan Carter was gone. Emily's sobs were muffled against her brother's still chest. her hands gripping his lifeless fingers, as if holding on tight enough could somehow bring him back. Tyson sat motionless, his jaw clenched, his fists tightening against his knees. He had been in fights where the air itself crackled with electricity, where every second was life or death. But nothing had ever felt like this. A nurse entered, her voice gentle but firm. "I'm sorry, but we need to—" Emily let out a broken whisper. "Just a little longer." The nurse nodded and quietly stepped back. Tyson swallowed hard, his gaze locked on Logan's face. Even in death, he looked at peace. The kind of peace only a man who had fought his battles and made his peace with the world could have. Tyson finally spoke, his voice low, rough. He was a fighter. Emily lifted her head, eyes swollen and red. "Yeah," she choked out, wiping her face. "The strongest one I ever knew." Silence stretched between them. Tyson reached out, placing a hand on Logan's shoulder, heavy, firm, a gesture of respect, a warrior's farewell. Then he stood. "Come on," he said gently, offering Emily his hand. She hesitated, her fingers still tangled with Logan's. Then slowly she let go. The days that followed were a blur of grief. The funeral was small but dignified, attended by fellow soldiers, close friends, and the few family members Emily and Logan had left. The flag-draped casket, the solemn words of honor, the sound of the rifle salute cutting through the air. It was a hero's farewell. But Tyson knew the fight wasn't over. The real battle was still ahead. The day was coming. The day Logan had sworn he would be there for. The wedding. And now it was up to Tyson to keep that promise. As the weeks passed, Emily did her best to keep moving forward, but the weight of her loss was impossible to ignore. Every step toward the wedding felt like a betrayal, like leaving Logan behind. Then, the night before the ceremony, there was a knock at her door. She opened it to find Tyson standing there, dressed in a sharp black suit. No words were needed. "I made a promise," he said simply. Emily's breath hitched, tears welling in her eyes. She nodded, unable to speak. Tyson stepped forward, gently placing a reassuring hand on her shoulder. "We walk together tomorrow." And for the first time in weeks, Emily felt like she wasn't alone. The day of the promise. The morning of the wedding dawned with a golden glow, but the air inside the small countryside chapel was thick with emotion. Every wooden pew was filled, but there was an unspoken acknowledgement of the empty space, Logan's space. Emily stood in front of the mirror, adjusting the delicate lace veil that framed her face. Her hands trembled, not from nerves, but from the weight of everything that had led to this moment. This was supposed to be the happiest day of her life. Instead, it felt like a battle between joy and sorrow, love and loss. A knock at the door made her freeze. She turned slowly. Mike Tyson stood in the doorway, dressed in a sharp black suit, broad shoulders squared, expression unreadable. For a moment, neither of them spoke. Then, softly, he asked, "You ready?" Emily let out a shaky breath, blinking away the tears threatening to spill. "I don't know." Tyson stepped inside, his presence grounding, solid like a wall against the storm of emotions swirling inside her. He looked down at her, eyes softer than she had ever seen them. "Logan made me promise," he said, voice steady, "and I don't break promises." Emily swallowed hard, her fingers gripping the edge of her veil. It should have been him. Tyson nodded. "I know." A thick silence hung between them. Then slowly, Tyson extended his arm. Emily looked at it, hesitated, then wrapped her hand around his forearm. Small, delicate, against the power of the man beside her. The chapel doors swung open. The entire room went silent. The guests stood as one, their whispers fading into stunned silence as they took in the sight before them. Emily, glowing in her wedding dress, walking arm in arm with Mike Tyson. Some gasped softly, others dabbed their eyes with tissues, understanding the weight of what was happening. Tyson moved with the same quiet confidence he had carried in the ring, a man walking toward a fight that meant more than any championship. Emily clutched his arm tightly, as if holding on to a piece of Logan, and in a way, she was. As they reached the altar, Emily turned to him, her eyes shimmering with gratitude. She didn't have to say anything. The look in her eyes said it all. Tyson gave her a firm nod, then placed her hand into the groom's. Logan should have been here, but in that moment, he was. The letter that shook the room. The ceremony had been beautiful, filled with love, loss, and an unspoken presence that everyone could feel. But as the vows were about to begin, The officiant gently raised a hand, pausing the moment. "Before we continue," he said, his voice solemn yet warm, "the bride has something she would like to share." A hush fell over the chapel. Emily reached into the folds of her dress and pulled out a neatly folded letter. Its edges were slightly worn, its paper fragile from the countless times she had unfolded and refolded it. She hesitated, her hands trembling. "This," she whispered, her voice breaking slightly, "was written by my brother, Logan Carter." A ripple of emotion passed through the guests. Some gasped softly, others instinctively reached for tissues. Emily took a deep breath and began to read. "If you're hearing this, it means I couldn't be here today. But don't be sad, I got to love you for every single day I had, and that's enough." Her voice wavered, but she pressed on. "Emily, you were always my little girl, even though I wasn't old enough to be your dad. Watching you grow up was the best thing I ever did. And today, as you start your new life, I need you to know something. I'm still with you. In every laugh, every tear, and every step you take, I'm here." A muffled sob escaped somewhere in the crowd. The entire room hung on to every word. Then Emily's voice softened as she reached the next part. "And to the man standing beside you, Mike Tyson, my childhood hero. I don't know if you realize it yet, but you did more for me than you'll ever know. You think you're just a fighter, just a man who throws punches. But you're more than that. You taught me how to be strong before I ever wore a uniform. You showed me that when life hits hard, you hit harder." Tyson swallowed, his throat tightening. His hands clenched into fists. But not from anger. This was different. "You didn't just walk my sister down the aisle. You gave her something no one else could. You made sure she didn't feel alone. And that means more than I can ever say." Emily's voice cracked as she read the final lines. "So here's my last request. One last promise. Keep doing what you do. Keep showing up for people. Keep proving that kindness still exists. Pass it on." A heavy silence filled the chapel. Then, someone sniffled. Another person wiped their eyes. Even the toughest guests, the ones who had tried to hold back, had lost the battle against the raw emotion in the room. Tyson stood frozen, his chest rising and falling in slow, deep breaths. For the first time in years, he had no words. Emily folded the letter carefully, pressing it to her heart. The officiant gave the room a moment to collect itself before continuing. But everyone knew. This wasn't just a wedding anymore. This was a legacy being honored. If this moment gave you chills, hit the like button and comment "legacy" below. And don't go anywhere, because what happens next will make you believe in the power of keeping a promise. The weight of a final request. The weight of Logan's words still hung thick in the air. Even as the officiant cleared his throat and guided the ceremony forward, no one could shake what they had just heard. It wasn't just a letter. It was a final wish, a last breath woven into ink and paper, a legacy passed on through the hands of those left behind. Mike Tyson stood near the altar, his hands still curled into fists, his jaw clenched as if he were bracing for a punch that never came. But this wasn't a fight in the ring. There was no opponent to knock out, no referee to call the match. This was something deeper, heavier, a battle fought in silence, with nothing but emotion as its weapon. Emily wiped the last of her tears and turned back toward her groom. As she took his hands in hers, she felt a shift in the room, like Logan had somehow made it there after all. The vows were exchanged, the rings slipped onto fingers. When the officiant finally declared them husband and wife, the chapel erupted into applause, though it was softer, more reverent than usual. People weren't just celebrating a marriage, they were honoring a promise fulfilled. Tyson exhaled slowly as he stepped to the side, his broad frame casting a long shadow against the chapel floor. His job was done. But as he watched Emily lean into her husband's embrace, something inside him stirred. For years, he had lived his life as a fighter, taking hits, dishing them back, surviving battles inside and outside the ring. He had won titles, lost them, regained them, and fought to rebuild himself again and again. But this was something else. This wasn't about a championship. This was about showing up when it mattered. After the ceremony, guests slowly filtered out of the chapel, their faces still carrying the weight of Logan's final words. Emily stood at the entrance, hugging each person who came forward, her hands lingering just a little longer, as if memorizing the warmth of every touch. Tyson watched from a distance, hands in his pockets. He wasn't the kind of man who stayed for long goodbyes. He had done what he came to do. It was time to go. But then Emily turned toward him. She walked forward, holding something in her hands, a small, neatly folded envelope. "He wanted you to have this," she said, pressing it into his palm. Tyson looked down at it, his throat tightening. The paper felt fragile between his fingers, yet heavier than anything he had ever carried. He nodded, silently promising that he would read it when the time was right. That night, back in his hotel room, the world outside moved on. Laughter echoed from the street below, car horns blared in the distance. Life continued as if nothing had changed. But for Tyson, everything had. He sat on the edge of the bed, staring at the envelope resting in his hands. Then, slowly, carefully, he opened it. The handwriting was uneven but strong, the ink slightly smudged in places. "Hey, Tyson, if you're reading this, it means I didn't make it. But don't let that get you down. I had a good life. And I got to meet my hero before the end. That's not too bad, huh?" Tyson exhaled sharply, the words hitting harder than any punch ever had. "I just wanted to say something I never got to tell you in person. You think you're just a fighter, just a guy who throws punches. But you're more than that. You've been inspiring people long before you ever met them. You taught me how to be strong, even before I wore a uniform. When life hit hard, I used to ask myself, what would Mike Tyson do?" The words blurred slightly as Tyson blinked, his vision suddenly unsteady. "You didn't just walk my sister down the aisle. You gave her something no one else could. You made sure she didn't feel alone, and that means more than I can ever say." Tyson swallowed hard, his fingers tightening around the edges of the letter. "So, here's my final request. One last promise. Keep doing what you do. Keep showing up for people. Keep proving that kindness still exists. Pass it on." The letter ended with one last line. "I'll see you again, brother." Tyson sat there for a long time, the letter still in his hands. Outside, the city moved forward. But inside, something had shifted. This wasn't just a promise fulfilled. It was a reminder of what truly mattered. A legacy that will never fade. Mike Tyson sat in silence, Logan's letter still gripped in his hands. The paper, fragile and worn, felt heavier than any championship belt he had ever held. Outside, life continued. The hum of the city, distant laughter, car horns cutting through the night air. But inside that room, time had stopped. He reread the final words. "I'll see you again, brother." Tyson exhaled, his fingers tightening around the letter before carefully folding it back into its envelope. He placed it on the nightstand, staring at it as if it might disappear, as if letting it out of his grasp meant letting go of the weight it carried. But this wasn't something he could let go of. It was something he had to carry forward. The next morning, before boarding his flight, Tyson made a decision. He wasn't the type to share personal stories, wasn't one to spill emotions for the world to see. But this wasn't just his story. This was Logan's, and Logan deserved to be remembered. He sat down, his phone in his hands, and for a long time he hesitated. Then, with a slow breath, he started typing. The post was simple, a photo of Logan's letter, a caption that told the world about a soldier who had given everything, not just on the battlefield, but in the way he loved, in the promises he made, in the people he left behind. Within minutes, the internet erupted. Thousands of comments, shares flooding in. People who had never known Logan Carter now spoke his name with reverence, with respect. The story spread like wildfire. News outlets picked it up, soldiers shared their own stories, families who had lost their loved ones in service reached out, thanking Tyson for honoring one of their own. People were moved, not just by Logan's sacrifice, but by his final wish. And in that moment, Tyson realized something. This wasn't just about one man. It was about all the people out there who needed to know that kindness still existed, that promises mattered, that loyalty didn't die with the ones who made them. Months passed, but Logan's name didn't fade. Emily, now happily married, started a foundation in her brother's name, the Carter Promise, an organization dedicated to supporting military families who had lost their own heroes. Tyson became its biggest supporter, funding scholarships, attending events, using his voice to make sure Logan's story lived on. And every year on Logan's birthday, Tyson would visit his grave, standing in silence, hands in his pockets, the weight of a promise still pressing against his chest. "I kept my word, brother," he would whisper, and somewhere, somehow, he knew Logan heard him.